more details on the nuances of this legislation, I want to turn to a guy who studies it all for a living, including in the field. Andrew Arthur joins us now, resident fellow in law and policy for the Center for Immigration Studies. Sir, good to have you with us.
Vince, thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. Okay, they refused to give us the text of the bill until yesterday. In the time you've had since its release, what have you determined about it?
That it does nothing to secure the border, that it gives more authority to the same people who created the border to disaster to begin with, and that it's going to make it even tougher for another administration to do anything to undo the damage that's been done to the bill. Done to the border.
Yeah, it seems like it. So I want to ask you some of the technical questions about it. So one thing, they claim that they're ending catch and release, this idea that illegal immigrants who are caught crossing into the country are then subsequently released into our country. That ends with this legislation, but that's not what I've seen. And Mike Lee and others are saying, actually, no, this codifies catch and release. Help us sort it out.
Yeah, and I do actually agree with Senator Lee and the others, including you, who say that. Because what this does is, with respect to aliens who, hire cheap smugglers or don't really understand how the border works, they won't go in and ask for asylum. But for everybody else who does ask for asylum, the bill gives additional authority to Alejandro Mayorkas, who's being impeached right now in the House of Representatives or considered for impeachment, to, in his authority, move all those people to a separate process by which it wouldn't be mandatory detention. It would be mandatory release. All of those people, including adults, would be subject to release on, alternatives to detention, call-ins and ankle monitors and things like that, and then would be subject to a process that provides many fewer protections for the American people with respect to fraudulent and bogus asylum claims. We know people have made those claims in the past in order to inflict harm on the United States, most famously Ramzi Youssef, who planned the first World Trade Center bombing. But by handing those cases over, taking them away from immigration judges and giving them to asylum officers, there are a lot of good asylum officers, but many of them aren't lawyers, and they don't have the depth of understanding that immigration judges have, nor do they have an ICE attorney in court with them to actually cross-examine the alien. This is, basically going to be a non-adversarial interview at which those determinations would be made.
Okay,
and the trigger would be the making of an asylum claim.
Okay, so there are two parts to what you just said that I want to assess. One is that they're removing the immigration courts from the process for asylum claims, and they're giving it to bureaucrats?
So they're not removing them entirely. They still leave that in place, but they leave it up to the Secretary of Homeland Security based on operational considerations, which are undefined, to send those people to a separate proceeding in which release would be mandatory, again, release on ATD, but release nonetheless, where there would be, layers of interviews and reviews and appeals that would stretch out that system, even though they, create deadlines that are never going to be met in the law. So, yeah, that's what this does.
Okay, and then the second part I wanted to ask you about is the adversarial nature, that is, of litigating an asylum claim. So if somebody makes an asylum claim, the way the system is supposed to work, as I understand it, is you have somebody who's there representing the American people who asks probing questions with the intention of basically establishing, no, this guy doesn't have a legitimate claim, therefore you are not eligible for asylum. So this bill would invert that, right, with a presumption of asylum being granted?
It wouldn't be a presumption of asylum being granted, but that critical adversarial piece you just described, Vince, would be gone. I was both a INS prosecutor and an immigration judge, and I can tell you right now that those prosecutors play a key role. When they cross-examine the alien, they probe for weaknesses in the claim, they offer impeachment evidence or contradictory evidence to undermine the alien's claim. All of that would be gone in this system that this bill would set up.
Amazing. So one of the other big pieces that really screams off the page is the decision to move a lot of the legal questions to the D.C. Federal Circuit Court that's in the bill. Is that meaningful to you, that they would move all of these really critical immigration questions to this super left-wing court based out of Washington, D.C.?
So that's consistent with the review process. It's actually the U.S. District Court. It's not even the Circuit Court. If you want to challenge the system that's either in this bill or that Mayorkas would set up, subsequent to this bill, the only challenge that you could bring would be, again, in what is widely considered to be a very liberal court, the D.C. District Court.
Right.
When they came up with that scheme back in 1996, it made a lot more sense. Today, it doesn't make quite as much sense. And I'm not going to say that that the decision is foreordained, but it's pretty close.
Yeah. Okay. What else jumps out at you from this bill? I mean, obviously the money really tells the story of it. It's $60 billion for Ukraine, $14.1 billion for Israel, and then $20 billion for the border mission that you're describing. But I'm not sure we could describe that as security.
Yeah, no, because a lot of that money is going to go to NGOs that will then, provide housing, transportation, care for those migrants. But that's not, going to be money that's going to go to local school systems that suddenly, need 20 more seats for kids who don't speak English. That's going to be money that's going to go, strictly for the care of those individuals. All of those costs, those downstream costs, emergency rooms, schools, additional infrastructure, none of that's going to be covered by this. And those are really the cost spends that we're seeing these cities complain about today: New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Denver. Those are the things that aren't going to be funded. That's, simply costs that the federal government is, passing on to states and localities that they're going to have to cover.
Yeah, and you mentioned the non-governmental organizations. Most people think primarily of Catholic Charities and a couple of others who are involved in human trafficking people more deeply into our country at taxpayer expense. This bill includes several $1 billion to continue to fund that effort.
Yeah, and again, it is one of those things where, I certainly don't want to accuse Catholic Charities or any other faith-based organization of actively trafficking people, but, they are facilitating the movement of those people into the United States. And when you talk about kids in particular, you're talking about, people that are basically unable to, defend themselves, who are subject to the whims of the most rapacious aspects of our society. So, yeah, I mean, what we really need to do is we need to discourage kids from coming to the United States and discourage parents from bringing their kids to the United States. And yet this bill does pretty much exactly the opposite of that. It simply creates more incentives for people to show up with kids so that they could be released in the United States. And with respect to unaccompanied kids, it provides them an additional incentive because if they're 13 or younger, it pays for their lawyers. Those
Right.
kids should never be in immigration court, Vince. That's really the fundamental flaw of all this. If you're going to have USCIS do anything, determine whether they have any relief, and if they don't, send them home.
Right, but were it not for all of this taxpayer money that's used to bring human beings from our southern border all across our country, there'd be one less incentive, one big incentive taken away for the cartels to be enriched by this human smuggling operation they're running.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when you think about the money that migrants pay smugglers to bring them to the United States, that more or less stops once they get to the physical border itself. At that point, it's the American people, voluntarily or otherwise, who pick up the tab to then move those people throughout the country that basically complete that smuggling or that trafficking conspiracy. And this is, you speak a bit more plainly than I do, but we're really talking about the same fundamental point, and that is, this is a system that is just fraught with opportunities for abuse. We should be doing the best that we can to cut off those opportunities for abuse, not aiding and abetting.
So in the final assessment here, in your view, does this legislation make the immigration crisis worse or about the same or certainly not better based on what you just said?
Yeah, no, I mean, of course, there is the 5,000 a day cutoff that's going to be the subject of discussions for the next, year at least. But, with respect to those incentives that we're providing people, the loopholes are still there. It makes them a little bit better with respect to the credible fear standard, but not enough to justify the cost of this bill and not enough to bless what the Biden administration is already doing. Congress can't legislate the will to enforce the border. But that's what's really lacking in this entire thing.
So,
Biden's got all the authorities he needs.
yeah,
Trump had him. Obama had him.
no question. As you examine how the sausage was made, do you have any sense of whose interests are actually being advanced by this legislation? You always wonder cui bono, who benefits, who's the guy who really drove all of this, because you have a number of Republicans in the Senate are offering full-throated endorsements of it, but I don't really see how they gained any meaningful concessions to restore our sovereignty.
Yeah, and given the fact that you're in D.C., you understand the appearance of action is often as important as the action itself. So this does, give those Republicans an opportunity to say, look, we're doing something, we're serious about this. If they're going to do something, and they need to, they should do something that actually really makes an impact.
Yeah.
Action without effects is worthless.
Well, it also is in some sense a giveaway to the big corporations who rely on importing cheap labor too. There's all sorts of carve-outs for H-1B visas built into this, including taking care of the children of H-1B visa holders. So clearly there's some corporate influence that exists inside of this legislation.
Yeah, and it also speeds the ability of these aliens that come and make asylum claims to receive work authorization. It cuts it from 180 days to 90 days in places. And again, that only benefits business. It doesn't benefit struggling Americans. And Lord knows in the national capital area, we have plenty of those. The fundamental purpose of the Immigration Nationality Act is to limit the amount of cheap labor that comes to the United States, to undermine American wages, and to diminish the working conditions under which American workers, both U.S. citizens and lawful immigrants, operate. And, as soon as we lose sight of that, we end up with bills like this.
Last piece, just to double back over the asylum claims. What has been the recent history of people who make asylum claims when they turn themselves into the Border Patrol and they say they'd like to claim asylum? To what extent did they ever actually show up to their court dates, should that date arrive, or are they granted asylum at all?
Yeah, and it's interesting because the asylum grant rate is actually around 11%, and it's getting lower. But the number of people who fail to appear in court, more than 159,000 respondents didn't show up in court last year and were ordered removed in absentia. That's not only a historic record, that is a historic record that blows away all previous records. So, yeah, this is just another sign of how the Biden administration is undermining the lawful immigration. It's breaking the immigration system. And one of the key complaints that Joe Biden made, both on the campaign trail and the president, is that, Donald Trump had broken the immigration system. He did no such thing. The person who's breaking it is the man sitting in the Oval Office.
And if Trump is successful and returns to the Oval Office next year, would this legislation kneecap his ability to get everything under control?
He wouldn't need it, but there are definitely aspects of this bill that, immigrants advocates would use to further hamstring his efforts. And we saw that numerous times over the course of his administration, in his effort to bring control to the border, particularly his ability. It doesn't actually impact his ability to reinstate remain in Mexico. But I think that a lot of advocates would say, well, you don't need it. Congress passed this fix for the law. So what you're doing is therefore something that the Supreme Court and lower courts should overturn because Congress has already fixed the problem.
Okay. All right. Well, Andrew Arthur over at the Center for Immigration Studies. Sir, thank you very much for your time and your analysis. As always, really appreciate that today.